Welcome to World War III. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome into a brand new series I'm starting that's just going to kind of be an ongoing update of the situation between Russia and Ukraine. Will it escalate? What are our options? This is episode 1, so I just wanted to talk about what is going on, what is the best case scenario this conflict between Russia and Ukraine ends, what's the worst case, what does America do, who is America's number one enemy, what does America need to be worried about right now? And guys, when it comes to the best case scenario on how this Russian-Ukraine conflict ends, I would say the best case we're hoping for, I hate to say this, but a potential assassination of Vladimir Putin. Now, I don't have, U.S. intelligence. I'm sure they know more than me. But, when it comes to if you killed Putin, what would that do to the Russian government? Is Putin really acting alone? We keep being fed this narrative from Western media that Putin is the crazy one within Russia and he's bossing everyone around. I don't know if that's 100% the truth, but I would assume, kind of similarly to Hitler with Nazi Germany, if you cut the head off the snake, Russia would really struggle, and that would be really good for the rest of the world when it comes to their military aggressiveness. And that would hopefully be someone acting within Russia, preferably a Russian, to potentially, kill Vladimir Putin. At this point, I think that's the best case scenario, because what people have started to do, you run through these different scenarios and they're just so unlikely. It's like, oh, the best case scenario is Russia right now to put down their arms and go back and say, Ukraine, we're sorry. That's just not going to happen. That's not going to happen. And what's also very likely not going to happen is Ukraine defeating Russia. Now, we all know Russia underestimated Ukraine, the amount of civilians that would stay back and fight for Ukraine. We've got NATO supplying Ukraine. But at this point, my best guess on how this ends, I don't think this ends it. I think this could be actually the start of World War III. We look back on history and say, what caused World War III? Number 1, Russia invading Ukraine. Number 2, China taking over Taiwan. You see the domino effect that happens. And this could be a 4 to 6 month campaign for Russia to get full control of, at least the eastern part of Ukraine, which would cause major issues around the world. And again, it's that idea. Ukraine is huge. If Russia takes Ukraine, they're almost well into Western Europe. Like, Ukraine is a big country. So I just think that is the most likely scenario at this point. It's going to be a longer 4 to 6 months drawn out process where Russia will end up taking Ukraine. The great thing for NATO and for Western allies, the fight that Ukraine is putting up right now is unbelievable, and it's causing Russia to lose a lot of manpower, lose a lot of assets, equipment. That's why NATO is perfectly fine with supplying Ukraine with all of this stuff. NATO doesn't have to lose any troops. I know it sounds bad, but Putin knew when he invaded Ukraine, it would put NATO in an extremely dangerous spot. That's why you've got NATO saying, listen, we're sorry, Ukraine, but we're not going to set up a no-fly zone. If World War III happens, we're going to make Russia start it. That's what NATO is saying. They're saying, we're making Russia start it. We're not going to do this thing where we set up a no-fly zone within Ukraine and we've got NATO, our armies shooting down Russian aircrafts, which would then possibly trigger Putin to launch a nuclear war against Western Europe. Another quick thing with the Russian overall arsenal when it comes to their nuclear power. There's a lot of misinformation going on about it, saying Russia's got, more nukes than the United States, more nuclear power. You really think Russia, a country that spends a fraction on the military as the United States when it comes to their military budget, you really think they have more nuclear power than the United States? What I'll say about nuclear power is this. I'm far more concerned about the Chinese and China's innovation on nukes than I am with Russia. Russia may have more overall nuclear warheads, but the overall nuclear power, the technology that goes into these things, many of these nukes that Russia has are extremely short range. You look at where Russia is compared to where the United States is in the world, it would be an extreme challenge for Russia to really launch one of these nukes and accurately hit a city in the United States at this point. That's why I'm more worried about China, and that's why at this point the United States really has to sit on the sidelines and listen to whatever the Western European NATO members want to do, because they're the ones that are really exposed to potential nuclear warheads from Russia. Russia would be targeting Berlin. Russia would be targeting, Italy. They'd be targeting UK, London, places like that in terms of their nuclear warheads. They wouldn't be aiming necessarily at the United States. Russia at this point feels, well, at least Putin, I don't know about their citizens. If you are a Russian citizen, I think you kind of have to root for, they're out there marching, I understand that, but they're in such a hard spot where Putin's completely shut off everything. Twitter is banned in Russia. I don't know about YouTube. I'm guessing all of it at this point is banned in Russia. Putin's banning it all. But it's like, if you're a Russian citizen, it's worse if you have to turn back with facing all these sanctions. It's almost like Russian citizens are forced to accept this war, because if you go against the war, Russia's going to be in a much worse place in the world. Just going back saying, Ukraine, we're sorry, whatever, we didn't mean to do this. They'd be at a much worse place, still facing massive sanctions, and you would have NATO, demanding Vladimir Putin removed from office, and really tons of sanctions against Russian military growth overall. So that would be, it's almost like Russian citizens are forced at this point to root for Russia, even though we've seen the protests, things like that. And, the real question is, America sitting on the sidelines right now. They are sending Ukraine lots of equipment. All NATO countries are, we understand that. But in terms of overall, they are sitting on the sidelines. What should America do? If I'm America, I would turn my attention to the Pacific states, in specifically Japan. And what I would do is I would set up basically a NATO agreement 2.0 with many Pacific countries. Again, the big one being Japan. Japan right now is an ally of the United States. We know about the rough history with Japan, the nuclear bombs. I've talked to Japanese people about that. It is a cowardice act, dropping nukes on innocent civilians. I agree. But again, we asked them, listen, you want to surrender? The war's over. We don't want to have to invade and fight you in the jungle with guerrilla warfare. We want to save our troops. And you know what? The Japanese Empire, Imperial Japan, they had such a great culture with the kamikazing and everything like that. They said, no, you need to come and take us over. And we said, we're not doing that. And you can say what you want about the 2 nuclear bombs that got dropped. It's unfortunate, but we need Japan right now, because China is the number one issue for the United States when it comes to overall military power, overall economic power, overall power within the world. China is the biggest, they are the biggest and most impressive counter force to the United States right now. When you look at how they're building up their military, their rapid growth in terms of military budget, everyone is focused on Russia, and rightfully so. They're the ones that invaded Ukraine. This is a massive land invasion. We haven't seen this since World War II, on this big of a scale. I agree. But what I'm also going to say, we're not seeing the level of concern with China, because many of these major corporations that control the narrative within the United States are in bed with the Chinese, are using the Chinese slave labor to mass produce products at a fraction of what they're selling for in the United States. And many of these American people are just blinded by it because the corporations control the narrative. They have all the money. They direct what Americans know. And people don't realize, they can't see through it. They don't understand that China really is the biggest concern for Americans. Now, you can say Vladimir Putin is the biggest concern. I agree. Again, when you talk about nuclear arsenal, 95% of these nukes that Russia has are more short-range nukes. They don't have the technology that the United States has. They don't have the technology that China has. So I almost think, and I've thought about this, I almost think it would be good for the United States if China took over Taiwan, because then we would get the American people opening their eyes and seeing, hey, it's not just Russia who, is doing things that are not good. You'd get more American people saying, what is China doing? They're real bad. We need to focus on them. And that's why I would create basically a NATO 2.0. Guys, Vladimir Putin feels very disenfranchised. The Russian people feel very disenfranchised. NATO left when the Soviet Union fell in 1991. You have to understand that. I mean, we're getting all this Western, media stuff and things like that, but NATO has really had control over all of Europe since the 80s, 90s. You know, obviously the USSR fell. They lost a lot of their land. And NATO laughed at them. And Putin, and you know, a lot of these Russian people do not like NATO. They don't like what they've set up, and they want to counter it, and they want their land back. Or their land, that they consider their land in Ukraine. They want it part of Russia, the Russian Federation. They want it to be on Russian land. They felt very disenfranchised. So you launch this big war with Ukraine to kind of counter NATO, and you put NATO in such a tough spot. I think the biggest concern is just the unpredictability of Vladimir Putin on what he's going to do, because now we are dealing with nukes. You know, you've got all these Ukrainian people saying, why aren't you helping us? Why aren't you coming to our aid? You know, Europe, you said never again. You know, no more Nazi Germany 2.0, land expansion, things like that. The problem is we're dealing with massive nukes now. I mean, listen, back in 1939, should we have allowed Adolf Hitler to have his massive, expansion in Europe? No. But at that point, it would have been a lot easier to combat that because Adolf Hitler didn't have nuclear bombs. Now, Vladimir Putin has nuclear warheads that he can very easily use against Western Europe. So I think Western Europe is doing everything in their power right now to de-escalate this situation. But the more you play it out in your head, it's like, you know, the best case scenario is just the pie in the sky scenario where Russia says, we made a mistake, Ukraine, we're sorry, we're not going to be able to take over Ukraine. We're just going to go back with all of our new sanctions now. We're sorry, we surrender, we'll go back to Russia, everything will be fine. It's just not realistic. And then it's like, let's say Russia takes over Ukraine. How long until they start going for the for much smaller NATO nations? NATO is a very interesting treaty where you've got a lot of extremely small countries involved in it, including like Lithuania, Albania. What happens? Would Putin dare test if he's able to get Ukraine, wait a couple years, take it over? It would be very hard to occupy, although we're seeing millions of refugees fleeing by the day into Poland. It still would be very hard to occupy. Ukraine is a big country with a large population, not a massive population, but a large population. That'd be the big issue for the United States if they had to face China and even India. If China, India, and Russia, I've talked about this before, if they form an agreement to rival NATO, kind of like the Axis in World War II, we're at such a point where it's such a mess, and it's like I'm playing scenarios out in my head. Russia takes over Ukraine in a 4 to 6 month battle, right? It's over. Everything's over. Now, Russia's going to want more. They're going to want more. They're going to go through a rearmament period, and then they're going to move on. And then maybe they say, you know what? Let's see if the United States will send troops to defend Albania. That's what they would do. And, you know, NATO's got its agreement where if you invade one of the countries, you will get crushed. That's basically what the agreement is. They will send force from every single country involved in NATO, including the United States, at the invaders, which would be the Russians. So Vladimir Putin doing this, it's just such an interesting time in the world. I guess interesting isn't the best word. It's a scary time in the world right now. And I just wanted to start this new series where we talk about it. You've got kind of Russia stonewalled right now, waiting for reinforcements. Their army, you know, people were saying their armies were sloppy. They weren't trained well enough. I think this is even more of a reason if you are America. You know, there's been this anti-military sentiment in America. We need to lower the military budget. I think we need more innovation in the military, personally. I'm not saying, you know, you need to go through $1 trillion. You need to open it to $1 trillion. Right now, I think it's like 780 billion or something. But, you know, organization skills, things like that. If we're up against a force like China with the amount of people that they have, to me, the United States versus China is basically the end of the world. Right, with the nuclear bombs, because like, how do you invade China with those people in Shanghai? Just the amount of people that reproduce in China, the populations are unheard of. We think there's a lot of people in LA, New York. Go Google population density in Hong Kong, in Shanghai, in some of these major Chinese cities. It's just Wuhan. It's just crazy how populated they are. And the number one thing I'm doing if I'm the United States is I'm setting up a NATO 2.0 with Pacific states, definitely Japan, because they actually have one of the strongest militaries in the world. I know we already have an alliance with Japan, I believe, but I would set up like a NATO 2.0 with a lot of different states on the Pacific side to protect ourselves against the Chinese. That's what I would do. You're not hearing this anywhere. It's not that I hate China. There's so much respect, right, that they're building this up. Obviously, you got to look at it from China's perspective. They're looking at America. America's number one. They're saying, why is America number one? Why does America get to be number one all these years? We want to be number one. America's had a stranglehold on being the, number one in everything. Military. I mean, look at the military budget the United States has. You think these other countries aren't ticked off that America is spending $600 billion more on the military, on their army than all these other countries? You don't think these other countries are mad at that? You don't think Russia is mad at what NATO did? When the USSR failed, where they laughed at them, where they've got this massive agreement now, where they bring the United States into it. All these Western European countries have this major buffer to where if we get invaded, we have the biggest army in the world on our side. You don't think they're mad about that? So this world right now, it's teetering. And we see this tweet, and you're going to start seeing more of this type of stuff with much of the world being distracted by Russia and Ukraine. I'm hearing a lot more things about North Korea now, increased activities at nuclear facilities and new construction at their nuclear testing facility. Now, if this came out when there was no war, this would be the number one story. Everyone would be talking about this. Everyone would be like, what do we do out in North Korea? North Korea, North Korea. Nobody's talking about it right now. That these other countries are going to start mobilizing bigger militaries. They're going to start testing nukes. North Korea is taking advantage of this situation where everyone's focused on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It's kind of like China potentially taking over Taiwan. Is China taking over Taiwan the same as Russia invading Ukraine? No, it's not. But if I can sell it to the American public that it's the same, I'll 100% do it, because right now the American public is blinded by the major corporations. The major corporations say China's our friend. They're really just the major corporations' friend because they can mass produce things with slave labor, not pay any of the employees. Apple does it, Nike does it. I'm sure you could Google all these major corporations, multi-billion-dollar corporations that produce all of their crap in China. But again, is China taking over Taiwan the same as the Russian invasion of the Ukraine? No, it's not. But if I can sell it to the American people that it's the same, then I'll do it. Because right now, the American people hate Russia. They hate Russia. But again, you're going to see more tweets like this. North Korea, again, this would be the number one story on the New York Times if this happens when we're at a peacetime period, when Russia is not invading Ukraine, but Russia's invading Ukraine. Every top story is an update. Every top story is a video of apartment building getting bombed in Ukraine. All these other countries are going to use that to their advantage and start doing things behind the scenes to where this would be a big thing if there was no war, but now that there's a war, we can do all this crap and nobody will care. The other big thing we're facing is just the crazy gas prices. And, Americans wondering, with America not getting oil from Russia, is that going to make the gas prices go up even more? We really I think there was an AP article that I read that it was like we really only get about 8% of our oil from Russia. So it's not like we're getting half our oil and now we have to go somewhere else. But this was a major problem. And this is really Joe Biden and the Democrats' fault. He wants to go green. He wants to rely on other countries to produce oil because America can't produce it because we're creating too many greenhouse gases, the CO2 emissions, things like that. And it blows up in your face. Now we're having to go to Venezuela, Iran, wherever to get our oil. It is completely ridiculous. This is a complete Democratic Biden administration talking point where just completely blows up in their face. This is from the AP. It says last year, roughly 8% of U.S. imports of oil and petroleum products came from Russia. So really just 8%, but again, it's not having that U.S. production. We need to be completely energy independent. If this war taught us anything, you cannot rely on other countries. Same thing with the pandemic. And relying on China to even import masks into our country. They were holding the masks and saying, you need to give us this, that, because they have the infrastructure where they create everything, they ship it over here and we sell it. So we need to be more independent. That should be a major thing that we learn from this Russia-Ukraine situation, from the current gas prices, the current inflation going on in the world, and it's just a complete disaster. And how bad is it going to affect the overall gas prices? This isn't a thing. Again, it's just like 8% in total we were getting from Russia that we're not going to get anymore because it's a lot more complicated with the Western European countries that are in NATO because they get a lot more of gas. This is really just America saying we're completely anti-Russia. We don't want anything to do with them. We don't want to give them any money. It's like we're giving them money to fund their war against Ukraine. The United States is saying we don't want to do that. It's only 8%. With the Western European countries, it gets more complicated because they get a lot more oil imports from Russia as compared to the United States. But I'm guessing gas is going to continue to rise. You know, you're looking at like $4.50, $5 here in Ohio. It's so brutal. I've seen screenshots, pictures of it being $6 in places in like LA, places like that. It's crazy. But guys, that's just an update. Welcome to World War III. I hope it doesn't come to World War III, but when you start playing out the scenarios, none of them end favorably unless somehow, I mean, maybe Putin gets assassinated or something like that, where it seems just like Putin, it's like Putin wants to be the god right now. Like he wants to make his mark. He wants to do something huge. And he's got these nukes. It's an amazing, counter chess move to say, you know what? If NATO gets involved, if you get involved, we're just going to blow everyone up because they have that power. They can do that. They can say, you know what? We're just going to blow places up. And then obviously the United States is going to have to respond by nuking Moscow or nuking Russia. It's a very tenuous time. And you're seeing NATO try to de-escalate things. That's why they're like, we're going to, what Ukraine is doing right now is unbelievable. They're weakening the Russian army. So what Russia thought is they would march into Ukraine. Ukraine would panic. They would be scared. Russia clearly has a bigger military. They've got a bigger military budget. They've got a lot of things that are bigger than Ukraine. And you would see Ukraine say, okay, we're ready to negotiate. We will surrender if we can maybe keep some of our land. Russia thought that's what was going to happen. It's not happening. Ukraine is fighting all their citizens. Well, not all their citizens, but there are a lot more citizens than anticipated that are fighting for Ukraine. And now they've got this energy of all of NATO behind them, where NATO's sending them everything. And it really is crazy. And NATO, I'm sure they love this Ukraine resistance where Ukraine is killing Russian troops. You're weakening Russian army. I'm sure Putin thought this was going to be a lot easier campaign that would have been over in a few days, honestly. Because it's just like you invade and it's like Ukraine's like, we're all going to die, we're scared. That's not what happened. They're fighting back. They are fighting back, and they've got a lot of people in their country that are fighting right now. It's amazing to see. But guys, that is going to do it for episode number 1. Just give you quick updates on what's going on. This is just kind of an overwrite, right? An overview. Not really much news in this episode. Just wanted to tell you what I would do if I was America. You keep supplying Ukraine. Let them keep weakening the Russian armies, as well as potentially getting a massive military agreement with Japan, with those specific states, those specific countries, to combat a potential Chinese kind of expansion that they're going through right now with their military. There's a lot of stuff to deal with China. Guys, it's been so tough. I have nightmares about China every night. It's a crazy time right now, but make sure you're following me on Twitter. Link to that's always in the description. I'm, of course, the Depressed Ginger. Thank you for watching.